The election of 1880 between James A. Garfield with his running mate Chester A. Arthur, the main person of this particular episode, going against the Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock with his running mate William H. English. Excuse me. Now, I briefly touched upon this when I was talking about James A. Garfield's presidential run in this particular election. I don't really need to go that in depth upon it for the most part, but ultimately a lot of things were happening. The culmination of a whole bunch of different practices and a whole bunch of different people rising up, the Greenback Party being present in this particular election, and a whole bunch of different things that really occurred. Loyalties between North and the South, tariffs, Chinese immigration was becoming a bit of a problem around this particular time too, but I'll get to that when I talk about Chester A. Arthur and his term as president. But ultimately, with the Republican Party united, Democrats kind of going back and forth and not really solidifying under one particular, I don't want to say ideology, but you have Northern Democrats that have a particularly different perspective, and then Southern Democrats who have a very different perspective as well, ultimately uniting against just anti-corruption in many instances, although Democrats themselves are just corrupted just in a very different way. And it's just one of those things where it's like the other party's like, oh, these guys are corrupt, etc., and yada yada yada, and then the other party, even though when they get in, they become even more corrupt, and the government just becomes an entire mess entirely. This is no different. Chester A. Arthur's role, though, ultimately, when he was being picked, ultimately as the vice president, as the compromise between Conkling and, to unite the Republican Party, ultimately, between the two factions, the half-breeds and stalwarts. Chester A. Arthur was, once he was nominated and once it was very clear he was going to be potentially the vice president, he went full bore. He was just basically like, fam, I'm going to do this the right way and represent my people, my party. He would go on speaking tours and actively campaigned, in which case you can ironically, unfortunately, make the assessment that he was technically like the first real modern politician in that sense. Ultimately, since he's going to be president, but he was the one that was on the campaign trail for James A. Garfield, along with Grant, Conkling, and a whole mess of other individuals and people that would lead to him becoming kind of like the eyes and ears of Garfield in a lot of ways. James G. Blaine, their relationship really blossomed during this particular time, which is a big reason why when he achieves political office and they win the election, that ultimately Chester A. Arthur will branch off against and go against ultimately Conkling himself. But he's campaigning, he's going through a whole bunch of different things. It's also very clear, too, there might have been corruption, obviously, that had actually occurred. I'm not going to be surprised by that. Maybe Arthur buying some votes. Who knows? A lot of things are not fully corroborated, not fully proven. There's one story in particular in Indiana where there might have been some shenanigans going on that might have actually helped them win the election specifically. Remember, and at the time, Indiana's got 15 electoral votes. So, if it's going to be a tight election, it could be the difference between winning and losing the election. But ultimately, the final results being that James A. Garfield would defeat Winfield Scott Hancock. Electoral votes between 214 to 155. Garfield would carry 19 states. Hancock himself would carry 19 states, and Garfield himself would barely win the popular vote. But ultimately, James A. Garfield would be the country's 20th president, and Chester A. Arthur his vice president. Now, as vice president, like I just mentioned very briefly earlier, that once Blaine starts really taking hold of the cabinet in a lot of ways, and Garfield is adamantly against Conkling in many aspects and in many ways, Chester A. Arthur, wanting to be on the president's good side, ultimately sides with James A. Garfield and Blaine, effectively cutting himself off from Conkling in many ways, and ultimately kind of just backstabbing Conkling. But at the same time, Conkling, he's not the best person either, so you know how it goes. It's politics, baby. But ultimately, when you're the vice president, you're basically the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, and especially considering at that time, I think there's 37 states, ultimately, and the entire country was split in half. I think there was 37 Republicans, Democrats, etc., etc. The Senate was really split, so Garfield would basically have really a lot of power, hypothetically, with a tie-breaking vote, ultimately. I think it's going to be very interesting had Garfield lived, how he would have legislated in that particular fashion and in that particular way. But Garfield was the vice president for like a couple months, really didn't do much. He was just there to help execute the cabinet appointments, along with Garfield, helping to adjudicate the process. Didn't really go well because Conkling, like I briefly talked about with Garfield's presidency, stopped a lot of it, really put forward a real roadblock ultimately in trying to do all those things that, you're supposed to be doing, And things just became difficult because of that. And then tragedy strikes, and Garfield gets shot. And it creates a lot of problems and a real big conundrum ultimately after the first 3 months. Because at that point, the presidential succession line has been very clear and very much solidified at that point. The vice president will take over. But Garfield hasn't died yet. He's been shot. And Chester A. Arthur, for the 3 months that Garfield's basically laboring near death, didn't do anything. So in a lot of ways, the country didn't have a president for the better part of 3 months. And for Arthur, based off of some biographies, based off of what I believe his reaction was shock, fear. It's kind of just like the kind of person who's, oh crap, what am I going to do? That's kind of how I view Arthur in many aspects. He's just someone that, once that actually happened and that became a particular reality, it shook him, for better or worse. It's probably the only way I could really explain it. And like I said in the very opening, he really held up into his house for quite some time because of this particular and potential fear of him actually becoming president, in which I don't really blame him. But ultimately, after some time and after a lot of reservations, Chester A. Arthur had no other choice. Once Garfield passes away and he pays his respects, Chester A. Arthur will be sworn in as his country's 21st president of the United States of America. He would take his oath of office in Washington, D.C. I think he would arrive there days after Garfield died, and he would take it before the Chief Justice, who at the time was this guy Morse, Waite, W-A-I-T-E, and basically would just shed tears of fear, excitement, and just an uncomfortable future that might lay ahead for Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur is now our 21st president of the United States of America. Chester A. Arthur's cabinet was basically, he just brought in, for the most part, Garfield's cabinet. They immediately went into blows and into conflict, especially with James G. Blaine and a whole bunch of other people for the most part. And in fact, aside from his Secretary of War, which is Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, every single person within that cabinet would effectively resign by the end of the year, for the most part. I believe the last one being the Secretary of the Interior, Kirkwood. But I'm not sure. It might have been him or the Secretary of Navy, William Hunt. But for the most part, he would have to replace every single appointment that he had within his cabinet. And I believe he's one of the very few presidents that actually never had a vice president, which is astonishing to me, to be honest with you. There was no successor ultimately, so that would create a whole bunch of different problems. So it's a good thing that Chester Arthur did not perish in any way, shape, and form. Some of the people that he brought in, Folger, Gresham as the Secretary of the Treasury. His new Secretary of State would be Frederick Theodore Freyleg. I'm terrible with these names. It was always just a revolving door, ultimately. He would always have different problems due to the initial political climate that really occurred during this particular time. The president really didn't have as much power since the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln was the president. So for a lot of these guys, it was always just a political battle and political machinations and a trial and tribulations ultimately that would lead to a dysfunctional, stagnant, centralized government that the country had during that particular point in time. So I think it's really interesting just to point little things out. Because I always point out, and I probably briefly talked about this earlier, was that the country, at the very least, or at least the federal government, was probably at its weakest, relatively speaking, during this particular point in time, post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction. So basically, once Grant leaves office, for relatively speaking, 20-plus years, the federal government's relatively pretty weak. And I don't want to say relatively weak. They still have a lot of power. They still have a lot of influence. They could really do a lot of things. But in terms of the main reason why they did it was because the checks and balances, relatively speaking, kind of worked. the South really stopped and stagnated a lot of different things. And in particular, I would probably say them not wanting to look and appear as corrupt as they were. A lot of presidents really held back on legislating in a lot of different ways that ultimately would lead to a lot of different issues. That's just my 2 cents. During his term as president, Arthur would have 2 vacancies to fill. He would replace the first one very early in his term was Justice Nathan Clifford. He was a Democrat, had been there pre-Civil War, and ultimately replaced him with a guy named Horace Gray, who would effectively be there for the next 20 years, adjudicating and legislating, or not legislating, but you know what I mean. He'd be there for the next 20 years, influencing the country. And then on top of that, another vacancy occurred. Ward Hunt, he retired later midway through, I think 1882, during Chester A. Arthur's presidency, which is interesting because there's a whole bunch of different things that came up about it, for political machinations and also just for sheer, let's just say, I guess I kind of owe you one kind of thing. Roscoe Conkling himself actually was initially given the nomination, but ultimately declined because, hurt feelings, boo-boos, etc., etc. And he would eventually nominate this guy, Samuel Blatchford. God, I'm terrible with these names. But he would serve until 1893. Sorry about the helicopter in the background. I will wait to record until the helicopter leaves. What is the country like when Chester A. Arthur takes the presidency? It's presidencies like Chester A. Arthur's and numerous other presidents, when you really look back and understand your history, or at the very least have a conception of history, and really look at everything. It's surprising if we've ever had a functioning nation to begin with. Chester A. Arthur comes in 1880, 1881, basically during a very tumultuous time, like always, in this country's history. There's a bunch of different things and a bunch of different machinations that are going on. The federal government is at its lowest point, ultimately. Reasons being corruption, etc., etc. Hayes didn't really do much to alleviate that in any meaningful way. Pretty much half the country hates the federal government. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of distrust and potential for a second civil war, little things like that, especially with a lot of the Southern Democrats. I guess you could say the more conservative, more white, I guess. But you know what I mean? Like, they kind of retook a lot of power in the South, and this is like the beginning of like the Jim Crow South in a lot of ways. That's coming up. A lot of things were happening. There's a lot of distrust in the government. Indian wars are still raging on, basically in the West and the Midwest, Custer's Last Stand, all that stuff. It's still kind of occurring throughout the entire country, so there's a lot of problems with that. Civil rights is still a big issue too, surprisingly in the North as well. Yeah, they might be free, but, they're not free in a lot of ways. And the Republicans are, in a lot of ways, abandoning a lot of black people, unfortunately, although they'll still vote Republican, which is a big reason why a lot of the Republicans ultimately win in a lot of these elections. And then foreign policy-wise, it's ever so more complicated. Excuse me. There's a lot of tensions that really won't occur until later, I would say, in Grover Cleveland's second term as the president, when, the Spanish still have control of Cuba. There's a lot of things going on there. And at least foreign policy-wise, tariffs, and economics, some relative economic stagnation. There's an interesting book there's a couple interesting books by the really great historian William Appleton Williams that I've been reading, and he really looks at history in the context of economics, and when he puts it in the perspective that he's putting it, it makes things fascinating, to be quite honest with you. And his arguments are really sound and poignant, and I don't know how to disparage any of them, to be quite honest. But he just makes a point that a lot of foreign policy, a lot of how our markets and how our country ultimately is, at this particular point, was very laissez-faire and ultimately screwed over a lot of different people. And while we achieved incredible levels of technological, financial advancement, you have to remember, we went from being like a backwater country, a backwater small republic in like 1812 that stood up to Britain, and ultimately within 2 generations effectively, was one of the leading economic powers in the world, even by, like, we were outpacing Britain, and they were the leaders of the Industrial Revolution in many aspects, in many ways. So, a lot of things were changing, and it's the changing of the guard in a lot of different ways, ideologically and politically speaking. The economy was changing in a lot of ways, and it started going away from, things that we need, raw materials, et cetera, to being like, guys like Henry Ford are going to be born around this time, and they're going to start creating these things and items and luxuries, ultimately, that are going to be a big part of economic growth that we're going to really be basing our economies on. And it's interesting to really to poignantly look at it. And tariffs were still a big issue, especially in the South, when there's no slavery, but there's still a bit of a bit of an agrarian society, along with some relative levels of industrialization that are going on. This country, and will forever be, ever since the Civil War, ever since the entire country's inception, is going to be very divided. And Chester A. Arthur is going to be taking over for James A. Garfield, who was supposed to come in and do the civil service reform and be forced to really take hold a lot of the things that Garfield represented and what he was supposed to bring and what he is meant to bring. So for Chester A. Arthur, in 1880, he's coming into his first and only term as president in a very, very tricky point in this country's history. For Chester A. Arthur, I'm going to, and probably for a couple other presidents, it really depends on who for the most part. I'm probably not going to use the timeline as much, ultimately. It's not as necessary for Arthur, ultimately, in many aspects, in many ways. Because for certain presidents, it's very clear you can very clearly just look at their entire presidencies, how everything went for them through specific key issues and key things that were occurring during this particular point in time. And for Arthur, it's very clear, I would probably say 5, maybe 6 things that were really occurring around this particular era that are pertinent to his presidency, and that really encapsulate all 4 years overall. Unlike certain other presidents where it's very strict that you should follow a timeline in order for things to be very clear, as a lot of those issues with other presidents tend to be cascading effects, where one thing affects another and affects another and affects another. And for Arthur, it's a little bit different, to put it. So for Arthur, I would probably start off with the first couple of things, at least in terms of domestic policy for sure. Civil service reform, reducing tariffs, Chinese immigration. Renovating the White House is actually one thing that should always be pointed out too, because Arthur himself was someone who really enjoyed the exquisite tastes, etc., and ultimately, along with his wife, Ella ended up I guess you could say, remodeling the White House. I think they at that time spent about $30,000, which would be $2 million in today's money. All taxes, by the way. I just want to point that out, which is great. And just renovating the White House and with lavishness, etc., classism, am I right? But ultimately, at the very least, in terms of the things that he was trying to do, was naval reform. He tried to really fix the South, Native American policy, etc., There's a whole bunch of different things that he was trying to do. So we should probably start off with civil service reform. Civil service reform was something that the Democrats really wanted, the country really wanted in a lot of different ways, shape, and form, but ultimately never really materialized because Congress was very stubborn, really corrupt during, I guess you could say, Grant's presidency, and really during Hayes' presidency too. I didn't really touch on it that much, but it was always really stagnant, and although, it sucks because Hayes ultimately was just more of a facade kind of president, in the sense that he really didn't do anything, and ultimately some of the things that really did occur were just more for show, like getting Chester A. Arthur out of the customs house, and it's like, I did this, huzzah, but it really wasn't much more than that, to be quite honest. And the country was really getting fed up. Arthur, very early in his presidency, wanted some relative civil service reform, but he wasn't going to bend at the will of everyone. He was going to do it his own way, which I admire in some aspects, where it's basically like, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it my way, and it's going to be the way that's going to be good, etc., instead of doing the will of the people. But Arthur came into the presidency wanting to be very different. He wasn't going to be held down and really, for the most part, persuaded by other groups and different people, which is a big reason why, a lot of his cabinet members would ultimately leave, Blaine, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that he was like a good person or that he was going to legislate and lead the country in a very uncorrupt way by any stretch of the imagination. But at the very least, it seems like he was focused, he was ready, and I think in some way, shape, and form, he was, because of basically just because of the direction of the country, basically because the people ultimately wanted it, he was forced to, one way or another, really improve the country through civil service reform. At the very least, do something. It was either that or the country was just gonna go up in flames because of disagreements. So initially speaking, there was a couple of different pieces that would come out of Congress ultimately that were basically for civil service reform in some way, shape, and form. The only piece that really went through but didn't really go anywhere in the initial going would be known today as the Pendleton Act. Effectively, the Pendleton Act just stopped in many ways, shape, and form salary kickbacks, appropriations, federal appointments along the states, and basically, in order to stop corruption, forced government employees to start at the very bottom of I guess you could say, the bottom of the totem pole and work their way up. It basically just streamlined the government in many aspects, just to, hey, you're not going to take any bribes, et cetera, any bribe, whatever, even if it could be politically biased, we're not going to accept, and it's going to take you down the totem pole. And that if you're going to reach your particular spot on that totem pole, you have to start from the very bottom and work your way up. So it's basically just like, a business in a lot of ways. We have to rise up from the very bottom before you actually get to the very tippy top. And Arthur himself was very, I guess, I don't even want to say he was skeptical specifically about this bill, but he's like, give me something else, preferably one by a Republican, because the guy who wrote it was this guy George Pendleton. He was a Democrat he was a senator from Ohio, as a Democrat, and for a couple years there was a lot of stagnation. Arthur had a whole bunch of different things going on, unfortunately, by this particular point in time, but unfortunately for Arthur, things would kind of just go down the drain. By 1882, during the midterm elections, the Democrats would just take over the House, and it was abundantly clear that the majority, or the relative majority that they enjoyed, was basically just not there for Arthur. And the Democrats had a lot more power and a lot of strength. So Arthur, unfortunately, for him to try and lead the country, was going to be cajoled because of the lack of power, ultimately, that he had within the executive branch. So by 1882, he's like, okay, I'll look at the Pendleton Act. We can work something out. I want to get this done, and I want to get it done the right way. So in order for the actual Pendleton Act to actually go through, it required a bipartisan 5-member examination board to look at basically everything that was within the federal government itself, which I want to point out is very interesting, that Arthur really quickly established the 5-member board and really went through all the investigations. So they went through an investigation of the entire federal government, saw a whole bunch of different things that they didn't like, and ultimately, after a lot of pushing and a lot of things, I guess you could say, and a lot of bribery, you know how it goes with the federal government, ultimately the act would pass, and the Pendleton Act would be the initial civil service reform that at least Chester Arthur can hold his head up high. It did a lot of different things. More so, really changed. The Pendleton Act is one of those things that the more you look into it, it's really interesting, because it also changed the way campaigns apparently were supposed to be financed too. Back then, businesses would, and corporations, or the equivalent would be a corporation back then, would really help finance a business, et cetera, et cetera. Now they couldn't do that because they didn't want to be in the pocketbooks of, big business people. So ultimately, it had to be privately funded or personally funded by, people, the people. Although that changed to effectively become rich people and rich donors, ultimately, that would help finance campaigns and a whole bunch of, I guess you could say, elections, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing really changes because of that. It just changed the way things ultimately operated in that fashion. Let's talk about tariffs. Tariffs are, export and import taxes ultimately, and like I said before, things really aren't that different from even in today's standards. It's not really that different ultimately. But tariffs ultimately, depending on where you're at, were going to be good or bad depending on how high or low the actual tariffs were. You have to understand that despite the economy changing in the South, ultimately, they still benefited ultimately from low tariffs. The North was basically high tariffs, and we can actually protect wages, et cetera, and ensure certain growth in certain industries. It's still an ideological battle, ultimately, between the tariffs and between, the ideological perspectives of the Northerners and the Southerners. And I think it's really interesting, too, that, for the first time in this country's history or not the first time. Let me restate that. One of the very few times in this country's history the entire government actually had a surplus of money. Yes, the government actually collected more than it spent around this particular point in time, which I gotta be quite honest with you, we will never see that probably in our entire lifetimes, which is unfortunate. But the United States government ultimately did have a specific surplus, and this created really a two-pronged issue in many instances, in many ways, for Chester A. Arthur and the Republicans and Democrats and just the country as a whole. The first issue was, you have a surplus. What are you going to do with that surplus? The surplus being, it depends on your numbers. At that time was about like $150 million in surplus, just from, the country having such a really good, relatively speaking, exporting and importing economy. And ultimately, I think it'd be probably close to like 100 to $200 billion in today's money, like the surplus, considered for inflation, obviously. There was real economic opportunities in which the country could go into. It's really interesting. A lot of people wanted to invest in internal improvements, better roads, maybe even some technological advances, conservation, and then, there's a whole bunch of big business people that are like, build more railroads, et cetera, build more canals, yada, yada, and do a whole bunch of different things. And then the other main issue is that, which goes along with what I was just talking about earlier, the tariff. Do you improve it? Do you lessen it? What do you do about taxes? In general. Now, Arthur was more so, but he didn't specifically choose any one particular side. In terms of the tax issue, he would probably be much more inclined to be with the Republicans, who advocated for generally high tariffs to protect American jobs ultimately, and et cetera, and produce more homebound. Although the Republicans themselves would really change their tune over time, especially with the growing problems that would occur during, I guess you could say, the Progressive era and in the early 20th century. It's gonna be very interesting, or it was very interesting, Arthur's perspective in a lot of ways. More often than not, he actually kind of sided with the Democrats in many issues and in many respects. Partly because, it's two reasons. Ultimately, the Republicans were not really super friends with Arthur at this particular point, and if he didn't do what the Democrats wanted in many ways, which the country ultimately wanted in a lot of ways, the Republicans would lose a lot of elections, which they did in the midterm elections of 1882. They'd lose the House and a whole bunch of different seats, and it would just make things more difficult for Arthur to get things done. Arthur's not a dummy. He understood overall the long-term goals, the political machinations. He was not very short-sighted, surprisingly, and showed a unique candidness about it in terms of his legislation, for the most part. So what was Arthur to do? Well, he did a bunch of different things. He ultimately ended up, especially during the midterm elections when they lost, but before that, he really thought about it long and hard, ultimately, with what he wanted to do. He wanted to cut taxes, cut the income tax, and really just cut taxes across the board except for, I think, whiskey and just alcoholic spirits, et cetera, and let people kind of just do what they want, which, mad props to the guy. But Congress felt a little bit differently. He appointed a special commission, basically saying that to improve the tariffs, it should be up to about 20 to 25%, or 20 to 25% reduction across the board, which everyone's like, oh my god, and it's really fascinating. He would actually veto one of the bills that would eventually pass. It would be known as the mongrel tariff of 1883, which would pass. So basically, the mongrel tariff dropped rates on a whole bunch of different items by about 1.5%, which was, at the time, depending on the particular item, a couple books called this the scientific tariff, which is interesting, especially for the Republican Party to really accept it, and Arthur to accept it instead of vetoing it. He signed it and accepted it. It was really interesting to put it into perspective. A lot of Republicans did not like that he signed it in ultimately, because it hurt Eastern political machines, Eastern manufacturers, etc., and Northern manufacturers, and made things a little bit difficult. For the country ultimately, which is interesting. The Republicans were not happy with Chester A. Arthur, especially by 1883. I'll get to that near the end of his presidency when I get to that point. Really, for the first time, I think that I've probably talked about in this entire series, immigration's a real problem in the country by 1880. To be quite honest, immigration's always been a problem. Really, within this country, the Irish coming over, French, other European, European countries coming over, especially some immigrants from Hispanic nations, the Spanish nations, but Asian nations especially too. The country had to deal with immigration. America's the idea of the American dream, laissez-faire, etc., and it's a very complicated issue and subject that a lot of people, especially today, in today's political climate, always like to make a big deal and point out in terms of the whole Anglo-Saxon white people having monopoly on a whole bunch of different things in this country. And, that's 100% true. So, it is an unfortunate reality that, this country was really run by those people. But at the very same end of the spectrum, it's... you're not going to see it in the reverse, to be quite honest with you. No one wants to bring up the point of, what if white people come to, like, Japan, for instance, and try to... I mean, even today, if a white person goes to Japan, the truth is they're probably going to be treated, relatively speaking, as a second-class citizen. They won't be, disparaged by any way, shape, and form, but, Japanese people will probably choose Japanese people, and Chinese people will choose Chinese people. It is what it is. It's just how things go. And I think America today is pretty progressive in a lot of ways. I mean, we are the idea of liberalism, for better or worse. I'm losing my train of thought on my point. What I'm trying to get at is immigration is a real issue. A lot of immigrants are taking a lot of hardworking jobs. The country has, I guess, a really poor middle class. A lot more people are taken out of the heap, I guess you could say, especially real natural-born Americans. But it's really difficult for immigrants, and specifically, really poor immigrants who come from this country, and a lot of, specifically different ethnic origins are going to have a lot of issues and a lot of problems. One particular issue involves the Chinese, who really first came over during the gold rush, and were, they're trying to mine gold, get rich there, built a lot of railroads there, and things were very, very tedious and difficult, especially out west when all the shenanigans are happening. That being said, I mean, it's very apparent and very clear that immigration, specifically Chinese immigration, was a real problem, ultimately. And what makes it interesting is that this is, in some ways, a bipartisan agreement to a certain extent between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans were much more sympathetic, to the Asian American immigrants ultimately, but even they were basically, along with the entire nation, to be honest, like, could you stop coming over here, and can we build railroads and stop taking jobs away from the white man? Numbers vary, but ultimately, a Chinese immigrant would probably work probably for a sixth of what a white American would work for, which that's going to create a lot of problems. Excuse me. And it became very abundantly clear that it wasn't going to be going away anytime soon. So Congress begins in 1882 to propose the Chinese Exclusion Act. And there's a whole bunch of different machinations that go along with it. But bottom line, it restricts aggressively so. Doesn't completely stop. It grossly restricts Chinese immigration for the better part of 20 years. Sorry, I have a really dry throat. For about 20 years. Now, this creates a whole slew of different issues. For better or worse, a lot of the economy was really built on the backs of Chinese people, and specifically Chinese immigrants, especially with the labors of the Transcontinental Railroad and a whole bunch of different things. They would work under the table and make things really prosperous for a lot of the richer individuals who would ultimately produce a lot within the country. Ultimately, though, Chester Arthur was really conflicted about it, for better and worse. He understood the reality of Chinese immigration, but at the same time, it was also, I don't want the economy to fail because we're just stopping people from coming into the country. But at the same time, it was a no-win situation regardless of what he chose, and especially at that particular time with all the pressure that he had on both sides of the political spectrum and both political parties. Chester Arthur, after some battling, would ultimately sign in the Chinese Exclusion Act with some relative concessions. Instead of a 20-year ban, it would be a 10-year ban, and the legislation themselves was written in a way that it wouldn't affect China, which I'll get to when I talk about Grover Cleveland, Teddy, and a whole bunch of other presidents that are going to follow him, especially Woodrow Wilson. That's going to be a fascinating episode. With China being the primordial goal. That's the big market of untapped resources, potential, and a lot of people that, they don't want to ruin any chances that they have with that particular market. The Chinese exclusion bill will be signed in, and Chinese immigration will be restricted for the next 10 years in this country's history. So in the country, civil rights, etc., for both Native Americans and blacks in the country was a big issue as well. Native Americans, the wars raging on in the Midwest and Midwest. This is around the particular time, though, that, the Indians just couldn't fight back. They just couldn't. The American army was just too powerful, too strong, and ultimately this is the beginning of a lot of reservations ultimately being created. A lot of them really started and began under Chester Arthur and subsequent presidents. A lot of them. Most of them that would be well known. They're actually used in movies. In basically the Dakota Territory, Arthur would sign an executive order late in his term as the president, creating that particular reservation, which would be known as the Crow Creek Reservation. Although Grover Cleveland is a very complicated president and revoked that order, I think, once they found out that, technically they do have title rights because of this one particular person back in 1805. Okay, I'm just going to revoke that and throw that in the trash real quick. And then civil rights reform. So they had the Civil Rights Acts and a whole bunch of different legislation to try and create equal rights within at least federally legislated. But at the same time, Congress, states' rights, Democrats, etc., things were becoming very tedious and tenuous within the South. Like I said, the Jim Crow South really starting to be bolstered by this particular point in time. And and it's also very clear that things are changing for better and worse in the South in a lot of ways. The Southern Republican Party is faltering in a lot of ways. A lot of black people felt disenfranchised by the Republicans, which is not helping the Republican cause in any way, shape, and form. That being said, there was a new, relatively speaking, a new political establishment, I guess you could say, a new political party that was really growing around that particular point in time. There would be, I guess you could say, it's like Republican Democrats. This new party was called the Readjusters. They basically wanted, relatively speaking, equal rights for a whole bunch of different things, and for both blacks and white people, education, patronage, everything you can think back about. And they're really good. They work with independents, the Greenback Party. Even some black Republicans started going on to their side because, there was some relative level of cooperation that would really occur there. And there was at the very least a relative slim hope that the South would, my goodness, would change course at the very least in terms of civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. But that would be basically just be gone by the time Grover Cleveland really comes into office. That being said, there is a sliver of relative hope of real freedom and equality that is occurring in the South that should be very much noted. Free state of Jones kind of thing going on. Now, I think we should talk about foreign policy because Arthur's probably one of the first presidents that really foreign policy is very imperative and important to his term and to the future of the country. There's this myth, in my personal view, that America isn't imperialistic or isn't an empire in any way, shape, and form. And truth be told, we've always been an empire, and we've always had some relative level of ambition towards that goal. We just had a lot of people in our country that didn't have that particular goal in mind, or at the very least explicitly advocated for it. We weren't always interventionists. I mean, for the love of God, Jefferson was advocating for destroying the pirates, and all that, and the during his term as president, and even before that, we've always been interventionists in a whole bunch of different ways. We've always wanted to try and take over Spanish America for economic purposes. The book by William Appleton Williams, which really helped change my perspective and really open my mind, really points out just the idea of the interventionist policies that this country's always had. And it really begins 100% full bore with Cuba and the Latin American countries around this particular point in time. Now, Chester A. Arthur, in particular, which, by the way, the book is the Tragedy of American Diplomacy, which I think you should read. I think I got the book right. It's only like 350 pages, but it shook me a little bit. That and The Contours of American History are really good too. For Arthur, a lot of things were really opening up by that particular point in time. Two things were happening, at least in terms of foreign policy, that are very important. More countries are being open to trade. China, like I said before. Japan's starting to become much more industrialized, and they're needing resources from the exterior. And it's going to begin this relationship with Japan that's going to go up and down, and then eventually, World War II, obviously. But ultimately, the big markets are starting to open up, and there's a lot of countries that have a lot of different products that America wants to use for their resources. Sugar plantations in South America, the Barbados areas, tobacco, all that stuff that they can import, export, raw materials that they can use for a multitude of different purposes and different things. And this required, at the very least, some strength. In a lot of ways, it's Teddy Roosevelt's idea of the big stick policy, speak softly but carry a big stick. In a lot of ways, it starts here in a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways. Not saying that Arthur was the jump start of it, but the ideas really start swarming around this particular point in time. And he really jump starts the idea of a reformed Navy. He starts allocating a lot of the surplus in a lot of ways, and a lot of money and tax revenue into fortifying the Navy, creating more gunships, approving funds for a whole bunch of different things. The Puritan, the Amphitrite, the Terror, the Monitor ships, effectively, and a couple other different things, sending them out to different contracts, etc., so that people can build them. America. But in a lot of ways, to really strengthen our resolve, at the very least, in foreign markets and overseas, because we've been basically, relatively speaking, in terms of relative comparison, less interventionist over the course of probably since like the War of 1812 to now. We haven't done anything with our Navy, really, for the most part. So it was very clear that the world's expanding. We need more foreign markets to really sufficiently grow our economy to an expedient amount, and that maybe we can start shaping the world into the American way, and it really starts here. So he really focuses on that for quite some time. Whether it was James G. Blaine started it, and then his other Secretary of State really pushed forward that, the Frederick Theodore Freire, I can't pronounce his name. He started doing a whole bunch of different treaties in Nicaragua. In a lot of ways, he actually I think he was actually specifically trying to start a treaty that would basically create like the Nicaraguan canal, if that makes any sense. With a stretch of land to cut the country in half for the big canal for trade, etc., etc. That really wouldn't get jump-started until Teddy Roosevelt, obviously, and it wouldn't be in Nicaragua, it would be in Panama, but a lot of different treaties in Santo Domingo, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and specifically Cuba really made things very interesting and very difficult. A lot of these treaties upset the Republican Party because it gave a lot more leeway to the other countries that, they had a lot more power and strength in terms of how they wanted to legislate, or now we're not going to give you this wool for this much. They gave him a lot more bargaining power, is ultimately what I'm trying to say. And, for Arthur, I think part of it was he didn't want to overreach. It was really laissez-faire, kind of just like, whatever, and not really thinking about the future. And also, I just don't think he wanted to piss off anybody, regardless of whether you're American or another different country. But ultimately, that's ultimately what really occurred. Foreign intervention really starts building up during Arthur's presidency, including naval reform and ultimately certain treaties with certain countries for export-import duties that gave a lot more way towards, the other countries having a lot more power, which a lot of, big businessmen, establishment people ultimately disliked for, because they're establishment people. Those are generally the big things that specifically occur, the major aspects of Chester A. Arthur's presidency. Now, if I can give you a quick rundown of effectively how it kind of happened, not necessarily a timeline, but just the trajectory of how things went up and down. So when Arthur came into the presidency, he was a relative unknown. A lot of people held out hope, but they were also resigned to the reality that nothing would probably get done. And Arthur himself was apprehensive to the reality that, oh God, I am president. Oh geez. Oh my goodness. Like little Morty-like, if that makes any sense, if you're a big Rick and Morty fan. That being said, I think once he really understood that he had that power, it wasn't going to be going away. He could have resigned and made himself a historical president in that particular way, being the first one to do so instead of Nixon. But it also became very clear that, when he looked into it, it was the country who had a lot of problems. There was a lot of things that were going on, political machinations, and Arthur had a lot of responsibilities to juggle, a lot of different people to make happy, a lot of different people that he had to answer to, for better or worse. Big business, Republicans and Democrats, a whole bunch of different people. It's a lot to be the president, to have a lot on your plate, and you don't know who to really trust, ultimately. And I think Arthur didn't really trust a lot of particular people, which is why when he went into the presidency, he was like, I'm going to try and do my own thing. I don't want to be influenced in any meaningful way, shape, or form. Which is why in the early goings of his term, a lot of his cabinet, or Arthur's cabinet, or not Arthur's cabinet, Garfield's cabinet ultimately ends up leaving. Some stay, because I think they wanted to give him a chance and see what happens. In the early goings, he does try to tackle a lot of different things, a lot of different issues. He starts with the country, domestically speaking. The country hasn't had a surplus in a long time, and both Republicans and Democrats are really trying to figure things out, and the people are trying to figure things out. Economically speaking, things were good and bad, and, there's a real big disparity between classes, the rich and the poor. Immigration's a big issue. So he's trying to tackle things one at a time. And ultimately, he fails, succeeds, fails, succeeds. It's an up and down roller coaster with Chester A. Arthur. And everything that happens ultimately has, I guess in a lot of ways, the people really liking him, adoring him in a lot of ways. They probably wouldn't re-elect him again, but they can't say in relative comparison that they are dissatisfied with the job that Chester A. Arthur has ultimately done, is probably, I think, what a lot of people felt at that particular time. I don't think a lot of people felt like he was a very strong president, very steadfast and very capable, but at the very same end of the spectrum, I think in terms of just the overall expectations, they were pleasantly surprised with how well he turned out to be. Now, over the course of his presidency, doing the appointments, et cetera, trying to do civil service reform, foreign policy, really changing it to become I don't want to say interventionist, but there's a lot more workings in terms of trying to create more foreign markets, and there's a lot of different things that are going on that, are really beginning under Arthur, and more likely because of Congress ultimately. But Arthur is the face of it, and I think in a lot of ways he actually kind of held back from a lot of things happening. For better, in my personal view, really restricted a whole bunch of different things to really kind of keep Congress and just the people and in both specific Democrat and Republican parties from basically just going full bore empire in many aspects. Now, that's not to say he didn't want an empire or anything like that, but I think even he was resigned and understood to the fact that it's a slippery slope. If once we go in that direction. So with it was just little things that he would help participate, facilitate in, and really impeded a lot of different things and fast-tracked a lot of different things that would hurt both, especially the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as well. Which is a big reason why the Republicans and Democrats over time just went lower and lower and lower in terms of the overall approval rating between both political parties and political factions. Stalwarts really didn't like him anymore, and I guess you could say the half-breeds really loved him, but also knew that he was a stalwart and wasn't probably going to vote him back in if given the opportunity. So he was being used in a lot of different ways, although the half-breeds would vote for him and in his particular direction, if anything that he produced for the most part. And a lot of things are happening to Arthur in his personal life and just in the country as a whole. Things are getting better and things are getting worse. For every good thing that happened, it was a bad thing that happened. And for every bad thing that happened, something good probably came out of it ultimately. For all the problems of economic issues, the country ultimately succeeded financially in many different ways. We had a very strong economy until I think 1893 when the next financial crisis occurs, and and ultimately what am I thinking? Sorry, my brain is not working right now. And for all the problems in terms of civil rights issues, the country themselves really starting to turn this, because this is the first generation after the Civil War where things are changing. It's a very, very slow process, but the Democratic Party ultimately in a lot of ways begins really taking, ironically, the forefront away from the Republican Party of civil rights. It really doesn't start here, but there you can see the grumblings that are really occurring. So I just want to point that out as a very interesting tidbit, in fact. Arthur himself is not feeling too well. Probably by, I would say, 1883 to 1884, Arthur is not looking too good. Physically, his health is deteriorating. He looks a lot older than he actually is. And specifically, losing a lot of weight. He used to be a real pudgy guy, but by the end of his presidency, it looks like he loses like 50 pounds, and people are kind of interested to why it's happening. So, specifically, what's happening to him is, it's called nephritis. In your kidneys, you have these nephrons which help filter a whole bunch of different things out, and effectively, he just has really bad kidney disease. He's not functioning really well. If he had, one of the, oh my god, my brain is not working right now. It's the actual machine that filters out your blood. Dialysis. If you had like a dialysis machine, he probably lives, but there was no such thing, unfortunately, back then for Chester A. Arthur. He was basically in his mid-50s by the point he started feeling it. And the elections coming up of 1884, that I'll get to when I talk about Grover Cleveland and a whole bunch of different people. And for the two main reasons, ultimately his declining health, but the other reason that he's just not popular. If he goes for a re-election bid, Chester A. Arthur would not win. The likely candidate probably would have been his former Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, and he would probably lose if there was a Republican primary or convention ultimately that would occur. He would probably be an interesting compromise candidate. I think he probably, if he was healthier, would have run, but that was the nail in the coffin once his health started declining. Basically, by 1883, Chester A. Arthur was resigned to the reality that he would only serve one term as president, and Chester A. Arthur would not seek another term of office. as I stated before, he had the kidney disease. I think it was called Bright's disease at the time, and specifically, he found out about it, I think, in 1882, 1883, around that particular point in time. It was eventually going to be a fatal disease, so I think which is the biggest reason why he was resigned to the reality, he wasn't going to run for a second term. He wasn't opposed to having people, go for him in the convention and stuff, et cetera, but he also wasn't like, definitely do it from here under the table. He really, I think, really didn't care. It was around this time, too, that while he's doing all the things with the country, the health is really impairing him. He's traveling a little bit to go to warmer climates that might actually refresh him. I think he goes to, like, Yellowstone Park at one point, and things are improving, at least for a little bit in 1883 and 1884. But he's also losing a lot of weight, and now it's really grossly starting to affect him. So 1884 comes around. The country's all over the place specifically, but it's pretty stagnant in terms of events that occur, things that happen, and ultimately he just is riding the waves of really doing nothing, and people are just working, doing their thing, and Arthur's doing his thing too, at least with whatever he can. So he's doing the last minute things, some more civil service reform, some more civil rights reform, some more economic things, especially with the reformation and build up of the Navy. He's trying to push for a lot of those things right before he leaves Congress, or not Congress, the presidency ultimately. 1884 comes around. James G. Blaine, he's basically the leader of the Republican Party at this particular point. Stalwarts are basically gone. You can thank Chester A. Arthur basically for that. He's kind of like the last one in a lot of ways, but the half-breeds really have a full control of the Republican Party, which are pretty socially liberal, fiscally conservative wing of the party. Ultimately is fully taken over. It's pretty cool. Excuse me. Republican National Convention comes around to James G. Blaine will win the nomination after 4 attempts, or 4 ballots technically, and Arthur would help to an extent, at the very least, promoting James G. Blaine in solidarity, basically like, congratulations, etc., vote for this guy, but he wouldn't really do much after that. I think Blaine had some resentment towards Arthur for not really helping with the campaign, but dude's dying, basically, so what do you expect? Once Grover Cleveland will win the election of 1884, he ends up leaving office in 1885 and comes back home to New York City in that beautiful brick house building. Damn, I forgot the actual address of it. I don't have it in front of me and I can't think right now. But he comes home and really just tries to enjoy life as much as he possibly can. He ends up basically just vibing, chilling out for the most part. Tries to go fishing. Can't really do that because the disease, Bright's disease, had actually taken some issues with his heart. He's basically just perpetually sick the entire time, unfortunately, which really hurt him. He loved fishing and couldn't fish, which is just unfortunate. He tried to go back to work, but go back to his law practice, but ultimately it was very difficult. Physically was incapable of doing so. So he was basically just stuck at home in the early goings of 1885 and really couldn't do much except just wither away, unfortunately. A couple months after his presidency, a couple of people, specifically the New York branch of the Stalwarts, which were still in a lot of ways the Conkling branch of the party, they asked him to try and run for the Senate, but he declined. He couldn't do it. He physically could not physically do it. And ultimately, he tries to go back to work. He basically is just an advisor to whatever law practice he was. I think it was Arthur Neves and Ransom, and really stayed out of the limelight for the most part. Doesn't really do much after that. He, for the last couple of years of his life, because he dies very young, one of the shortest post-presidencies of our country's history. He spends some summers in Connecticut, goes into basically just try and enjoy life as much as he can. And on November 16th, he falls because of a cerebral hemorrhage, ultimately, and never regains consciousness. He dies a couple days later on November 18th at the age of 57 years old. Chester Arthur, our 21st president of the United States of America, ends up getting buried in New York City a couple days later with his family there. how do you define Chester A. Arthur? How do you define his presidency? How do you define everything in a retrospective perspective and look? That's a very good question. It's very difficult to really assess certain people sometimes, and corruption, etc., is corruption, and people are complicated. But I think if Chester A. Arthur's presidency really shows anything, it just shows that nothing's perfect. Nothing is ever as seamless as you want it to be. Nothing is ever really anything that looks and is cut out to be. How do I really can't explain this. Let me go through my thought process. Information, trying to find facts, etc., etc. It's always very complicated, especially in history and specifically post-Civil War era United States. There's a lot of, I don't want to say disinformation, but I always find it interesting that a lot of books and a lot of biographies tend to paint a lot of these billionaires and positive lights, etc., when they really had a lot of control over the country. And I always think it's really interesting. Same exact thing with certain politicians. A lot of people hold up these people and a lot of the presidents as really just obscure people that really didn't do much, for better or worse. But in a lot of ways, you could argue they did a lot of worse for the country and showed how deep corruption could potentially go, whether it be Hayes, Grant, Arthur, Garfield, even Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison, etc., etc. I think it's really interesting to try and scour as much detail as you possibly can, and every single day that I do more research and every single day that I look into more of these people, the more I find conflicting data of everything. That this person did this, but then there's this source that says that. I guess what I'm trying to say is with Chester A. Arthur, just like a lot of these presidents post Grant, I guess in a lot of ways, it's very difficult to try and figure out, the truth from fiction sometimes. And, if you had to look at Arthur objectively, you see him as a guy who, in earnest, really was not a very strong person emotionally. In a lot of ways, I think was very empathetic, very considerate of a lot of different people, a lot of different perspectives, enjoyed the finer things in life, and ultimately lived his life in that particular way, even if it meant being a little corrupt and around around certain issues and things. And I think he in a lot of ways wanted what was best for the country, if not for the fear of upsetting the populace and the people. And I think it's just really interesting because, like a lot of these presidents, especially post Grant and all of them, you go back and forth between how you feel about them, the perspectives on how you feel about them. My perspective of Hayes changes every single day, and same with Arthur. Because one day I'll be thinking to myself, for everything that was put up against him, when you look at the amalgamation of, this guy never specifically, I think, aside from being the vice president, really held elected public office before, until he was the vice president, and then basically gets thrusted into a position that he didn't want or was very ill prepared for, and I think was put in an even more position where he didn't have a lot of power, have a lot of sway, and ultimately had to do what the Democrats wanted, or just what the people wanted, going against his own personal bias, etc., etc. And I think it's interesting because I think you have to praise people like that to a certain degree and to a certain extent, but it's also undeniable too that there's something about Arthur that the levels of little things that he could probably potentially get away with, I think, has to be noted as well, and really just put a bit of a damper on something that he really could have had a fantastic and fascinating history ultimately. And it's interesting because on one hand he's one of those guys that once he left office, I think the people liked him, but then especially with subsequent presidents, history looked at him a little bit more down in comparison, because it's like, well, he didn't do anything. At the very least, Grover Cleveland, Harrison's the $1 billion guy, and William McKinley was one of the more popular presidents until Teddy came around. So he goes into obscurity, and I think a lot of people post-presidency tend to look down on Chester A. Arthur and his overall reputation and his overall legacy, I guess. I don't think he was a bad president. I think he was a human being who chose before his own term as the president, some levels of corruption to satisfy his own personal wants. I think in a lot of instances he did try to be a good person, but he's just like, if I can get away with this, I'll get away with it. I think a lot of us would do the exact same thing. Let's just be honest. It's kind of like if you work at like a fast food restaurant. It's like, if I'm gonna just take a large fry, it's not like it matters. It's one of those kind of situations, if that makes any sense to anybody. Arthur, though, was one of those guys, though. I'm very curious, if he didn't have Bright's disease, what his historical legacy would have turned out. I'm not saying he would have won, but I think there's a hypothetical and potential argument that he compromised a lot more than I think people realized, and there's a possibility that he could have been the Republican nominee, maybe ran and won and got a second term, or maybe would have ran again later on after Cleveland's first term. Who knows? Maybe Benjamin Harrison probably won't be the nominee, or Blaine probably wouldn't have been the nominee. Who knows? And I'm very curious to see what his legacy would have looked like, because right now it's clouded. And, there's certain presidents that have second terms, and it's definitive in a lot of ways, their overall legacy of who they are. You can argue certain presidents had an indisputably good legacy or indisputably bad legacy, depending on how their second term goes out. It's like if Obama had just one term, it'd probably been like a what if, but now that we know what it is, it's like, oh, that's not good, and same exact thing with like George W. Bush, where it's like, oh, he only got one term, but then it's like, oh, that's not good either, and I think it's one of those particular situations where, and again, I don't like playing what ifs, I really don't. I keep saying that a lot, and I keep thinking about what ifs. So call me a hypocrite. It's okay. Arthur, though, he's always going to be in a bit of an enigma to me. Just like, Garfield. That's what's interesting. Out of all of these, post-Reconstruction presidents and I guess you could say 20th century presidents, he's probably the most conflicting, because I don't know how I feel about him. I think I have a pretty square idea on like Rutherford B. Hayes, and I think Garfield's pretty clear once you look at all the little things that he does. But for Arthur, it's just little bits and pieces of relative corruption to him actually like trying to work with the people and Congress to try and get things done to help facilitate a better country. So I think it's really interesting to look at it in that view, because it leaves me really just needing more information before I can personally make my own biased ideological opinion of Chester A. Arthur, because right now I can't. So he's kind of like an incomplete to me. He's the enigma. I know who he is, but at the same time, there are actions that he does that conflict with the things that he objectively believes in or does, and it's really conflicting. Because the truth is that I've come to realize after looking at history is that, if there's actual corruption, or there's actual problems, like, if people do real shady things, they're probably pretty shady, and vice versa. They don't do these things. More often than not, they're probably not that bad, but, if you can find one or two things, it's like, oh, excuse me. Well, that's not a good characteristic of you, because it's probably indicative of you being not a very honorable individual person, like the Republican Party in the 2000s, and the Democratic Party in the 2010s, and today. You know what I'm saying? Ultimately, and that's just how I see it, and that's just how I look at it. And for Arthur, he does one thing that's corrupt, and then he also does a lot of things and really abdicates a lot of things for a lot of people. Point being, like when he was doing his whole commission for the Pendleton Act, it's like he has every reason to not do it, but the fact that he expedited it, ensure that it passed through Congress, is also very confusing, because it could potentially expose him to a whole bunch of different things, which also goes to show that, and that was a bipartisan thing, so Democrats had every incentive to get him out of there, unless it was one of those situations specifically where it was, we'll keep him there because, he's doing a lot of good things that we want specifically, so, politics. But who knows? if it was like modern politics today and anyone tried to do that, like for instance, modern interpretation of politics to 2020, if the Republicans try to do anything like that, or, the Democrats would be like, do everything they possibly could to stop it, or vice versa, because it's politics, and you know how it goes. Arthur, though, he's just confusing. So my final thoughts. Arthur is one president that if I was going to choose to write a biography about, he'd probably be in my top 5, if I'm going to be honest with you. He's fascinating. He's an enigma. I mean, if I had to make my list of presidents, I think Reagan would probably be up there, because he himself is incredibly fascinating. I think FDR is up there. I think Wilson's up there for various different reasons, other than Reagan. I think Washington's very, very interesting. I think William McKinley is very interesting. And I think Arthur would probably be up there, to be quite honest with you. The more you look at Arthur, the more a picture gets muddled. And the only way you could really look at it is through the various little things that he would do in his everyday life. He's a very clean person, very much about his own physical appearance, probably because he was a little pudgy, probably didn't really think of himself that much, and had a fantastic mustache, which I probably should have talked more about, because that thing is fire. If you ever get to see a picture of him, if you see this video, just, my lord, look at that mustache. Come on, fam, it's beautiful. The only way you can really, at least in my view, look at how people act, react, and go about their everyday lives. It's in a more interpersonal setting. I think you get a much better picture of them ultimately, and a much more interesting and much more emotionally tying, and I think much more honest interpretation of the individual in person. And for Arthur, it's confusing. It's very, very fascinating, though. So I can give my final thoughts on Chester A. Arthur. A complicated president with good, bad, and ultimately did a lot more than I think people realize, and also was someone that I ponder and think, what if? One of the very few times that I will adamantly say what if. Because ultimately, it's not a what if of what he could have been, but it's a what if in the sense of who he actually is. If he had another couple years, I think I might have been able to figure out really who he is and the overall context of his own life, his own legacy, and ultimately just who Chester A. Arthur, the handlebar mustache man, ultimately is. Thank you guys for listening. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Have a great day, guys.